Across the vast expanse of our planet, history has witnessed countless battles. Empires have risen and fallen, armies have clashed with thunderous force. Yet in the annals of human conflict, there exists a war so peculiar, so astonishingly bizarre, that it stands apart as a testament to the unpredictable nature of life itself. This, my friends, is the story of the Great Emu War of 1932. Imagine, if you will, the Australian outback, a sun-drenched land of rugged beauty and unforgiving extremes. Picture now, amidst this stark landscape, a war waged not against a human enemy, but against a foe far more feathered, and dare I say, far more comical, the emu. Yes, you heard that right. In the heart of the 1930s, Australia, a nation known for its rugged pioneers and formidable wildlife, found itself embroiled in a full-fledged war against a bird. The enemy? A large, flightless bird known as the emu. These avian adversaries, standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing over 100 pounds, had developed a rather inconvenient habit of raiding farmers' crops, leaving behind a trail of agricultural devastation in their wake. The farmers, facing economic ruin in the wake of the Great Depression, had reached their breaking point. They demanded action, and the Australian government, perhaps caught up in the spirit of the times, decided to respond with the full force of the military. To understand this bizarre conflict, we must first journey back to the Australia of the 1930s. The world was in the throes of the Great Depression, an economic catastrophe that had crippled global markets. Australia, heavily reliant on its agricultural exports, was hit particularly hard. The once booming wheat industry found itself in a state of crisis, as prices plummeted and farmers struggled to make ends meet. The vast Australian outback, home to countless sheep and cattle stations, was also feeling the strain. The land, often unforgiving and prone to drought, seemed to mirror the economic despair that had gripped the nation. It was into this environment of hardship and uncertainty that the emus made their dramatic entrance. Emus, native to Australia, are nomadic birds, renowned for their size and their ability to travel long distances in search of food and water. With their powerful legs and remarkable resilience, they are perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of the outback. However, their nomadic lifestyle often brought them into conflict with humans, particularly farmers. As the Great Depression tightened its grip and crops became increasingly precious, the emus' foraging habits transformed from a nuisance into a full-blown crisis. Imagine, if you will, the scene. Thousands upon thousands of emus, driven by instinct and hunger, descended upon the farmers' fields. These weren't mere raids. They were full-blown invasions. The emus, undeterred by fences or the pleas of desperate farmers, feasted on the precious wheat and other crops, leaving behind a trail of flattened fields and shattered hopes. The farmers, already grappling with the economic despair of the Depression, watched in dismay as their livelihoods were devoured by the relentless avian horde. Their frustration was palpable, their anger justified. Their crops, their very sustenance, were being decimated by these feathered fiends. The emus, for their part, were simply following their natural instincts. They were hungry, they were thirsty, and they were following ancient migratory patterns that had sustained them for centuries. They were oblivious to the economic hardship of the humans, to the desperation in the farmers' eyes. They were simply emus, being emus, in a land that was as much theirs as it was the humans. This, then, was the crux of the conflict, a clash between human needs and the natural world, between economic survival and ecological balance. To arms, the farmers declare war. The farmers, at their wits' end, appealed to the Australian government for help. They demanded action, and action they received. Perhaps influenced by the prevailing mood of the time, or perhaps simply caught up in the sheer peculiarity of the situation, the Australian government decided to deploy the military against the feathered foe. Yes, you heard that right. The Australian Army, veterans of the Great War, were now tasked with waging war on emus. Armed with Lewis guns, those fearsome weapons of war, and carrying thousands of rounds of ammunition, the soldiers set off to the Western Australian front. The mission? To engage and eradicate the enemy, the mighty emu. The very notion seems ludicrous in hindsight, a Monty Python sketch come to life. Yet, in the context of 1930s Australia facing economic hardship and the very real threat of agricultural collapse, the decision to deploy the military against the emus seemed, to some at least, a necessary and even logical response. The stage was set for one of the most bizarre and quixotic military campaigns in human history. The Great Emu War had begun. The initial skirmishes of the Emu War were nothing short of farcical. The soldiers, accustomed to facing human enemies in the trenches of Europe, found themselves woefully unprepared for the challenges of avian warfare. Emus, it turns out, are surprisingly difficult to hit with a machine gun. They're fast, they're agile, and they have a remarkable ability to absorb bullets. The soldiers, hampered by their heavy equipment and their unfamiliarity with the terrain, found themselves outmaneuvered time and again by their feathered foes. Newspaper reports from the time are filled with accounts of emus sprinting away from hails of bullets, seemingly unharmed, or simply disappearing into the vast expanse of the outback. One particularly memorable dispatch describes a group of soldiers attempting to ambush a flock of emus, only to have their Lewis gun jam after firing a mere 12 rounds. The emus, unfazed, simply ambled away, leaving the frustrated soldiers choking on their dust. The emus, it seemed, were winning. The Great Emu War, rather than being a decisive victory for the Australian military, was rapidly descending into a comedy of errors, a testament to the unpredictable nature of warfare and the perils of underestimating one's opponent. The Australian government, facing mounting criticism over the apparent ineffectiveness of the EMU campaign, decided to call a temporary ceasefire. The soldiers, relieved to be out of the line of fire, returned to their barracks, no doubt with some rather colorful stories to tell. The emus, meanwhile, continued their relentless march across the countryside, their hunger unabated, their reign of feathered terror far from over. The first battle in the Great Emu War, it seemed, had been a decisive victory for the birds. The government, however, was not ready to admit defeat. A second military offensive was launched, this time with even more troops and firepower. Once again, the soldiers marched into the outback, Lewis guns at the ready, determined to vanquish the feathered foe. And once again, the emus, employing their remarkable speed and uncanny ability to dodge bullets, outmaneuvered and outwitted their human adversaries. The second offensive, like the first, proved to be a costly and embarrassing failure. The emus, it seemed, were simply too numerous, too elusive, and too darn resilient to be defeated by conventional military tactics. The Australian government, faced with mounting public ridicule and the realization that they were essentially fighting a losing battle against a bird, decided to cut their losses. The troops were withdrawn, the Lewis guns fell silent, and the Great Emu War, much like the flightless birds it sought to eradicate, faded into the annals of history. The Great Emu War, despite its farcical nature, offers some valuable lessons. It highlights the dangers of underestimating the natural world and the folly of applying military solutions to complex ecological problems. The emus, in their own way, reminded the Australian government, and indeed the world, that nature is a force to be reckoned with, not a problem to be solved. Section 8. The Emu War Legacy, a cautionary tale of conflict and coexistence. The Great Emu War, despite its comedic overtones, serves as a potent reminder of the often complex relationship between humans and the natural world. It highlights the challenges of coexisting with wildlife, particularly in situations where human activities intersect with the needs of wild animals. The emus, in their own way, were simply trying to survive, to find food and water in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. Their conflict with the farmers, while undoubtedly frustrating for the humans involved, was ultimately a symptom of a larger issue, the challenge of balancing human needs with the needs of the natural world. The Great Emu War, in all its absurdity, continues to capture the imagination. It's a story that has been told and retold, each retelling adding to its legend. The emus, once seen as agricultural pests, have become unlikely folk heroes, symbols of resilience and the indomitable spirit of the Australian outback. Section 9. Beyond the outback echoes of human-wildlife conflict. The Great Emu War may be a particularly striking example of human-wildlife conflict, but it's certainly not an isolated incident. All over the world, from the suburbs of America to the African savanna, humans and wild animals are vying for space, for resources, for survival. Whether it's elephants raiding crops in India, or coyotes preying on livestock in the American West, the underlying tension between human needs and the needs of the natural world is a constant theme. These conflicts often arise when human development encroaches on wildlife habitats, forcing animals into closer proximity with humans. As human populations grow and expand, these conflicts are likely to become more frequent and more severe. Section 10. The Unpredictable March of History, a universe of strange encounters. The Great Emu War, with its cast of unlikely characters and its utterly absurd premise, reminds us that history is full of surprises. It's a story that could only have happened in Australia, a land where the wildlife is as iconic as the landscape itself. But it's also a story that speaks to the universal human experience, to our capacity for both great folly and remarkable ingenuity, to our often complicated relationship with the natural world. So the next time you find yourself reading about some obscure historical event, some seemingly insignificant footnote in the grand narrative of human history, remember the Great Emu War. Remember that history is full of strange and wonderful tales waiting to be discovered. Section 11. Conclusion. A salute to the absurd, a nod to the future. The Great Emu War, in all its absurdity, serves as a potent reminder of the unpredictable nature of life, of the often comical interplay between human ambition and the raw power of the natural world. It's a story that teaches us to laugh at ourselves, to appreciate the unexpected, and to approach the challenges of the future with a healthy dose of humility. The emus, those feathered veterans of Australia's strangest war, continue to roam the outback, a testament to the enduring power of nature. And as we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, facing new challenges and unforeseen obstacles, perhaps we can learn a thing or two from these flightless birds. Perhaps like the emus we can learn to adapt, to persevere, and to never underestimate the power of a good laugh. As we conclude our journey into the annals of avian warfare, I leave you with this thought: if a nation as mighty as Australia can be humbled by a bird, what other surprises does the future hold? What other strange and wonderful tales are waiting to be told?